Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the MP Sanders podcast. Today, we're going to cover a pretty specific topic, so it probably won't be too long of an episode, but we're going to talk about free speech today. There is a whole lot of misunderstanding that I see about this topic pretty much any time it's brought up. Now, that isn't to say the majority of people who talk about free speech have a misunderstanding of it. It's just that if someone is having a debate with someone else about it, particularly on social media, you can be guaranteed at least one of them will have some sort of misconception when talking about this First Amendment in the United States. So, we're going to cover that, and we will go ahead and get started. So, we're going to go back to the normal setup for these podcasts over the past few, and I'm going to read from a script and then talk about something off script for a little bit afterward. So, every so often, free speech becomes the heart of serious debate in the United States. We are one of the only countries in the world that actually has speech protected in the way that we do. And the First Amendment in our Constitution reads specifically that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition to the government for a redress of grievances. Notice that the entirety of this amendment is solely focused on the government, or Congress. This is where a lot of the confusion about free speech comes from. A great example is how people talk about big tech companies and social media sites. When Alex Jones and people like Gavin McInnes were banned off of Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms, a lot of their followers were in outrage, saying that their free speech was offended or taken away from them. And that's not really true, because the First Amendment doesn't say anything about private entities. It is Facebook and Twitter practicing their free speech by banning these people. Just like it's the free speech of a private citizen to block someone's phone number, or get a restraining order, or tell people to stay away from them, or to avoid people. That's what speech is. It's the exact same as a restaurant or business saying that we have the right to refuse service to anyone, or no shirt, no shoes, no service. These are just limitations that these company owners are setting up regarding who and why they will provide service to. Facebook and Twitter felt that their terms of conditions for providing their service were not being met or were being disobeyed by people like Alex Jones and Gavin McInnes. It is well within their rights to throttle, thwart, or prevent anyone from using their platform. And it is also their complete right to regulate the ideas shared on their platform. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a moral thing to do, and there's endless debate about whether or not they should do it from a moral standpoint. But there should not be any debate on whether or not they should be allowed to do it from a criminal or governmental standpoint. The First Amendment only applies to the government's ability to enforce speech or religion standards onto the people they are governing. It has zero applicability to private entities or companies. I am able to make any criticism I want about the government without facing criminal charges. That is what free speech boils down to. If I were to say the American government planned, allowed to happen, and funded and orchestrated the attacks of 9/11, there would be no consequences for doing that aside from some social consequences of being like ostracized by certain people and things like that. Now, if I were to specifically target one person and say John Doe planned, orchestrated, and funded 9/11, the chances of being hit with a defamation lawsuit go up tremendously, because it's a private entity punishing me for the things I said about them. That is another limitation. The government is not allowed to do that, but private entities can do whatever they want. It is their speech to make me face consequences for saying incorrect, false, and defaming things about them. Now, there is another common argument made that these large social media sites have the ability to sway elections due to their presence and power, and that is true. However, what does that matter? Is that not the end goal for every single political activist or political advocate in the world? To grow a platform, persuade people to join their side of the debate, and convince people to vote for the candidate they support? I mean, even the current president, Donald Trump, does not hesitate to say at all that Charlie Kirk helped him win the election to begin with. And since Charlie has that reach and pull with the organization Turning Point USA, does that mean that Turning Point USA shouldn't be able to regulate the ideas being shared at their conferences? or that Charlie Kirk shouldn't be able to regulate the people speaking at those conferences? Of course not. That is the point of starting organizations and companies, to express your opinions and your ideas. And just because Facebook and Twitter have a lot of power regarding social discourse does not mean that they should not be able to decide what ideas and people are on their platform. And this debate always comes back into the spotlight after the death of a influential or important person, particularly if that person is controversial. Even the death of someone like Barbara Bush, George Bush's mother, was met with sorrow and celebration. And the people celebrating her death are the reason that free speech always ends up coming back up in situations like these. A Fresno State University professor said that Barbara Bush was a racist, that she raised a warmonger, and that she is happy the quote-unquote witch is dead. That wasn't necessarily the exact order in which she said that, but those were the exact words that she used. Many people, including Fox News, which is one of the weirder ones because modern conservatives are always claiming that they are the free speech warriors, many people were claiming for her to be fired. And the university investigated it and determined that she made these claims on a private Twitter account, not representing the university at all. And since Fresno State University is a publicly funded organization that gets grants from the governments, they have to behave as a government entity. And she did not say anything that required her to be fired by that token. They have to follow the rules that the government has to follow. She is allowed to say whatever she wants, as long as she is not representing the university while doing so. Obviously, her comments were gross, stupid, and full of moral grandstanding that doesn't have any value to anything other than her own vanity. But then again, it also was not illegal. Just because someone says something disgusting or something you don't like, doesn't mean that they should face criminal action. And it certainly doesn't mean that the government should step in and play a role in firing her from her job. That is ultimately up to the university, but since they are a government organization, they have to follow these rules. If it was a private university, things may have gone a little bit differently because they have a little bit more leeway with how they enforce these rules. Another side of this discussion that is growing more and more popular and controversial is this idea of hate speech. Something I spoke about in the Political Violence podcast was that as political polarization and really social polarization continues, the presence of people essentially speaking different languages starts to become more and more present. And a topic where this Tower of Babel-esque inability to understand each other is absolutely present is in hate speech. It's not difficult at all to find people accusing others of using violent rhetoric. That is a nonsense phrase. The word violent is defined in the dictionary and pretty much every encyclopedia you can ever find as behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. Notice the word physical in that definition. It is not saying linguistic or psychological or verbal. It is explicitly referring to the physical attack on someone. Using the established definition, it is impossible for violent rhetoric to even exist. People who make this claim have taken a word and completely changed its definition to help push an idea, agenda, or rhetoric that they support. And in my opinion, if it is necessary to do that, then your rhetoric is probably pretty stupid and flawed. If you have to change definitions for it to be valid at all, then it's nonsense. And this general sort of vocabulary wordplay is always playing a role in the discussion of hate speech. People are actively calling for hate speech to be a criminal activity. And in some countries, particularly in Europe, we are seeing that take place. Now, the definition given by Britannica for hate speech is speech or expression that denigrates a person or persons on the basis of alleged membership in a social group, identified by attributes such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, age, physical or mental disability, and others. When I read that definition, I always leave thinking, so hate speech is just an insult? And we're trying to ban insults and calling insults violent rhetoric? Really? Adults are doing that right now? Would it be every single insult that is considered a hate speech crime? If not, who determines what the line is between criminal hate speech and non-criminal hate speech? Are we going to put some sort of government agency in charge of that, or will it be people we elect to make those decisions? Because unless you're really willing to advocate for jailing everyone for every insult or distasteful thing they've ever said, you have to think out how this actually takes place. Because it's going to require some sort of official making the decisions of who goes to jail and who doesn't for what words. There is a much simpler solution here, and it's called being an adult and understanding that there are idiots in the world who say disgusting, hurtful, and idiotic things. And just because they say those things does not mean they need to go to jail. Typically, what it means when someone says things like that is we just ignore them, and that there are social sort of consequences for doing that. There's no need to push this into the world of criminal. Pretending that just because you've been offended by something, and a lot of times there's sort of this, you're required to be offended about it, sort of twist on this. And the existence of your offense is reason to criminalize another person is narcissistic, immature, and unbelievably short-sighted. Are we really going to pretend that these people calling for hate speech crimes have never insulted anyone or said anything that could be considered hate speech? I find it almost comical that many of the people I see saying things like, oh, he spread violent rhetoric, the same people that are celebrating or are at least completely indifferent to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. The short-sightedness is on hilarious display there, because I guarantee you that a conservative could argue that celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk is hate speech. I have a feeling that the people advocating for the criminalization of hate speech are really only advocating for it to be applied to the people they are at opposition with in terms of social policy and political policy. They don't want a blanket application. Well, if they do, again, they're short-sighted, but I don't think they're actually that short-sighted. I think they understand that hate speech is a very vague term and definition that could be applied to pretty much anyone on the planet at some point in their life. They have said something hateful, insulting, etc. So they don't actually want these laws to be applied for the greater good of society. They want it applied so that they can silence politically opposing people. And they also advocate for these laws and rules for vanity's reasons. They want to seem like they are morally superior to people who are not calling for this. They want to act like they are the protector of offended people and marginalized groups. When in reality, this all seems to be fueled by nothing other than narcissism and self-worship. The First Amendment is the most important amendment in our Constitution on a grand scale. They all have essentially equal importance, but the First Amendment is just slightly above the rest in this regard. When we look at historical dictatorships like the USSR, for example, we see what happens when free speech is wholly abandoned and speech is enforced by the government. It isn't pretty at all. People are arrested for everything. They're arrested for criticizing the government. They're arrested for words said in private letters. People were arrested for saying they are hungry and depressed, which is something you see a lot of on the hate speech side, a lot of depressed people that are angry at society. Conservatives love to focus on the idea that the Second Amendment was created to help the American citizens oppose government tyranny. I do not think that is the reason it was created at all, and I think supporting that idea towards it today is pretty nonsensical. The most powerful military in the history of humanity is going to be thwarted in its attempts at tyrannizing the people due to some private gun ownership? No, of course not. If the government used the American military today to tyrannize us, a few Americans owning guns would change absolutely nothing in their ability to do so. And to be clear, I am a gun owner. I love the Second Amendment, and of course it should never be abolished. I love guns. I just do not agree with the justification for it that is for opposing government tyranny. We would be able to do nothing to our government or military if they decided to start tyrannizing us just because we own guns. Now I know that every dictatorship in the history of the world, or at least modern world, where guns were readily owned by civilians, that one of the first things they did was take away people's guns. And of course that is important, but it's also important to realize that the main thing they did was take away people's speech. There is no better tool for a tyrannical government than criminalizing speech. And the reason for that is because everyone speaks. Everyone says distasteful things. Every single sentence can be interpreted as distasteful if someone tries hard enough to do so. This is why I say the First Amendment is the most important of them all, because the abandonment of it gives the government a level of power over its people that is not comparable to anything else. It is important that we Americans understand what free speech means and what the consequences are for criminalizing speech at all. It doesn't lead to any type of good road, and in my opinion, the people advocating for hate speech are only doing so to afford themselves unearned moral value. And the most important part of free speech is allowing people you don't like to say things you don't like. And this has been on, I don't want to say good display, but it's been on display after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. there have been people celebrating it, and not just subtly celebrating it, but dancing in the street with a megaphone chanting "We got Charlie in the neck." And people have shown various forms of celebration on TikTok. And again, that is disgusting and despicable and pathetic, in my opinion. But I don't think anyone should be advocating for that action to be a criminal act. And I completely understand why conservatives and people who supported Charlie Kirk are struggling with this. He was something of a hero to them, especially when you consider the fact that he seemed to be a rather normal person with rather standard conservative views. As I said in my political violence episode, he was not a Gavin McInnes or Alex Jones character. So many conservatives feel that they took a completely innocent, unextreme conservative person and assassinated him in public in front of his family. So again, I completely understand this sort of knee-jerk emotional reaction of saying, punish them, they're celebrating this. But it's important to have this foresight that I mentioned earlier. It is disgusting, pathetic, and stupid, but it should not be a criminal act. We must always defend free speech in the United States, even when that includes defending people's right to say things that we do not like, even if that stuff is hateful, stupid, and disgusting. We must have the foresight to see that any transgression against the First Amendment creates a foundation on which tyrannical people can build. If we lose sight of everything else, we must never lose sight of what it means for our speech to be free and what it means for our speech to be criminal. For the unscripted part, I want to talk about Trump's executive order banning burning the American flag. I think burning the American flag is an example of free speech, and it should absolutely be protected by the government. Now, I have read Trump's executive order on this a few times. The first thing I want to say is that it is horribly written. I had to read it multiple times, not because I had to digest a information dump, but because I had no fucking idea what it was even trying to say or do because it is so poorly written. Once I finally reached an understanding about the executive order, I came to the conclusion that it didn't actually achieve anything and was pure political theater. Because all it says is that it is illegal to burn an American flag in a place where there is a burn ban, in places where setting things on fire is illegal, like in cities, and that if a non-citizen immigrant were to burn the American flag, that they could, not will, but could lose their immigration status. As far as I'm aware, it was never legal to burn the American flag in an area with a burn ban or in a city. You would face fines just for setting anything on fire in those areas. Now, just because it was political theater does not mean that I approve of the general message that Trump was trying to send with this executive order. In no world should we be infringing on the First Amendment right, even if it is just political theater. People should be able to burn the American flag, and they should be able to do so without interacting with the government at all, because it is free speech. Just like people kneeling for the national anthem should not face any governmental or criminal consequences from doing so. This does not mean that if you burn the American flag that you shouldn't be able to get fired from your job, or that social media groups shouldn't be able to ban you for doing so. It is simply saying that the government has no business infringing on people's speech in any capacity at all. So I wanted to keep this episode short, and I just wanted to talk about that in kind of an unscripted way. And I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and I hope you come back for more. Again, regular uploads will be coming on this podcast, and I'm also now on Spotify at the MP Sanders Podcast. So if you don't want to have to watch this video on YouTube and you want to listen to the podcast while driving or doing something, I'm available on there now, and I am working on getting on iTunes as well. So thank you all for watching, and we will see you next time.